I am delighted to be here and delighted to introduce our guest, Eric Schmidt. Readers of the business press mostly know Dr. Schmidt as the grown-up who was brought in to watch over Google's young founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, in 2001, and to take the company public a few years later. But I have to say that description does not do him justice. Among other things, I learned just earlier today that he is a pilot who flies his own commercial jets, not just like little private planes, commercial jets. He is also a tech geek in his own right, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the word. He grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where as a young teen he discovered programming, and as he once said in an article that we Googled, when you're 13, you either go with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or you find a hobby. After graduating from...
I had forgotten that quote. This is the problem with search engines.
After graduating from Princeton and from UC Berkeley, where he earned a PhD in computer science, he went on to a career at Xerox PARC as the chief technical officer at Sun, and ultimately as the CEO of Novell before joining Google. At Google, he has overseen some notable successes, taking the company public in 2004 and leading it as its market cap has quintupled to a recent $117 billion, of which he owns 4%. I will save you from doing the math. That works out to about $4.8 billion. But there have been some setbacks and some growing pains. Some of Google's new products have not performed quite as well as expected, such as Google Video and Google News. The company's come under fire for censoring its site in China. And it has been criticized, perhaps inevitably, for being the new Microsoft, as in being too big and too powerful for its own good. At the same time, Microsoft is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to try and keep Google at bay. Yahoo, under Terry Semel, is competing fiercely for that online ad business, which accounts for 99% of Google's $7 billion in revenue. So Eric's challenge now, obviously, is guiding Google into the future as it morphs from a search company into a much more complex organism. A word about today's proceedings. We're going to speak for about 25 minutes, just have a conversation, after which we will welcome questions from the audience. And with that, it is my pleasure to please welcome Dr. Eric Schmidt.
By the way, that was way too embarrassing an introduction. I am so glad to be here at the center of New York and of the industry as a whole. We have, I think, assembled here the top people in my business. So thank you very much. Just happens to be about you guys. And so it was very convenient for you to do this. The most important thing to note is that there is a real lack of professionalism going forward. There's all sorts of people trying to do all sorts of things quickly, poorly, business coverage, so forth and so on, and the rise of blogging and so forth and so on. So here's a group that's going to bring literally the very best and highest standards, right, for the things that I care about. We need more of this, right? That's why what portfolio is so important. And I think that the more voices, especially the more voices where you have people who have the ability, I'm not saying this right, but you get the idea. The people who have time to do the research, figure out what's right, figure out what's wrong, figure out what matters. And I think that's why this is so important. That was my opening.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we are delighted to have you with us. I'd actually like to start out, it's about your 5-year anniversary. You've been there for about 5 years. You've had these spectacular successes. You've had some of these challenges. I'd love to know if you had, in these 5 years' time, if you had one do-over, what would it be?
I think at Google, everything is about speed. And when we look at the pace of innovation and the rate at which we try to do new things, if we'd done any particular thing 3 months earlier or 6 months earlier, we would have been much better. So in everywhere where we don't have a perfect outcome, we typically see things, but we either don't have the resources or we don't have the right focus yet. And in these very fast-growing businesses where you have this huge opportunity space before you, it's really about speed and decision-making. we do this as well as I know you can. We have this bizarre structure which is not very tightly managed. We have a lot of creative teams that move very quickly. They're hard to organize. We exhort them to do new and creative things. We give them the freedom to innovate. There's something called 20% time where engineers can invent new things. Most of our new inventions come out of that. If we could just make it happen faster, I think that's how I would, that's I think the answer to almost all of the criticisms.
Mm-hmm. Is there one particular, is there a product that you feel that you could have either come out, should have come out sooner or should have been different?
Well, the China decision, which is I think the most controversial one that the company has been through, is one that in hindsight we could have done earlier because that market is growing more quickly. I don't think we would have changed the decision. I don't think it would have, but I think earlier is better.
Mm-hmm. That's a decision, this is the decision to essentially self-censor the site in China. And I know that you've been a vocal defendant of that action, and I think I'd read at some point you said it would have been arrogant to tell a country how to run itself. But I'm curious, last week I believe it was Sergey who came out and said that, it seemed to contradict that, and he said it would be reasonable to stand on principle against censorship and not operate there.
We actually went on the specific story. It turns out that what he said was consistent with what I say. And so, in fact, it appears to have been either nuanced or being misquoted or something. In the China decision, the problem we have is we have 110 million Chinese getting on the internet, and they would benefit from the things that Google offers, both in terms of the information as well as the access. And the problem is that if your mission is to serve all the world's citizens, it doesn't say excluding Chinese. And so we face that as a moral challenge, and we spent an awful lot of time debating this, and we decided ultimately that we would delete some of the things from the search engine that are not legal under Chinese law. This is a relatively small number of things, but obviously it's the things that people care a lot about, who worry about these things. And we decided to do a couple of other things that are notable. One is that we're the only organization that notes that we deleted something. Now this seems like a minor thing, but it's actually very important because the end user then knows that some information was withheld from them by their country's laws. And the second thing, which is I think the most important thing we've decided to do, is to not put personally identifiable information in China so that people who do things that might be an issue with Chinese authorities will not be subject to the current laws within China with respect to their emails and so forth and so on. And we think that provides an appropriate end-user protection from our perspective, and we're not going to be involved in any of these sort of terrible stories of people being investigated and so forth by the secret police and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, so how does that gel? I'm not quite sure I understand. Maybe you can explain for us. When Sergey said it would be reasonable to stand on principle against censorship and not operate there, was he... How is that consistent with...
Actually, just to be very precise,
yes.
we actually went through the transcript, and there's a whole other part of the transcript that was omitted in that quote. He was saying that, then there's a but. But we decided, based on essentially the two choices of lesser evils, if you will, that it was more important to serve the end user. Mm-hmm. And so we continue with our current China strategy.
I see. Okay. Google now is primarily a search company. We refer to it as a search company. But with all the new products that you're developing, is this something that, will it always be your primary business?
We think so. Search turns out to be the unifying problem. And here's the easiest way to think about it. Think about all those disk drives that everybody is buying, putting on their personal computers, the new disk drives that are in your phone, right, on your PDA and so forth. People are producing a tremendous amount of information. There's so much information that the only way to deal with it is going to be fundamentally variants of search. And so we're going to remain focused on search, I think, forever. One of the interesting things that we do is we look at the percentage of emphasis we place on core search and core advertising. As you noted, 99% of our revenue is from the ads business. And we make sure that we have at least 70% of our resources focused on our core business. And I can explain the math behind the 70%, but it's the right answer. And so the most recent analysis we did a couple of weeks ago said we were down to roughly 60%. So again, we're now transferring even more engineering people and other resources into search and to advertising.
Can you clarify that a little bit? When you say 60% in search, when you were down to that, that means in terms of amount of time being spent on it or revenue?
Part of the way we manage the creativity of teams is we let them pretty much chart their own course. We don't have a central planning in quite the way a traditional engineering company does. And the reason is that these sort of centrally planned companies tend to become less and less aggressive as they get larger. The product lines become less and less interesting, for all sorts of reasons. And so we're trying to build creativity at scale. And so we encourage people to do things, and then we measure it, and then we see what outcome we got, as opposed to telling them, hey, you work here, which they don't really like to hear anyway, because people want to do what they want to work on. And so, for example, I just sent out a memo yesterday which went through the key priorities of the company and encouraged people to move to these. Now, and that works, because people want to work on the important things.
So if they're moving to them, they're moving away from
the lower priority ones. The percentage we use is 70% on our core business, 20% on things which are near our core business. So you mentioned news and video. Those would be in the 20%. And then we also reserve 10% of our activity for other. And other is anything else. And I know that sounds sort of crazy, but it's a fundamental part of how we operate, because in the other, we allow people to dream, to think about new ideas. And the trick is we let them dream by themselves. They don't get large teams if they're in the other. And then they have to justify their ideas, and then we move them into these other buckets.
And some of these other buckets now that you would be more interested in, that you think are going to move into perhaps your core business, would be such as what? I mean, are you looking at music, phone service?
Well, let me give you an example of one which is fascinating, which is radio advertising. I know we have people who are in the advertising business, both as producers and consumers of advertising. So why, when people are in their cars, why doesn't the car give you an ad that says, Eric, you need new pants. There's a pants store to the left. Right? No one's ever heard that ad, right? It makes sense. It literally makes sense, right? Because the car has a GPS, the radio knows where it is, right? The owner of the car is typically the driver, or maybe there's two people, or maybe it can be, you can make a generic, the family all need new pants, or whatever metaphor you want. But this is possible, and it's possible within the next year or two. Now, those ads are going to be much more targeted. So using the 20% as an example, it turns out that the set of radios that are coming out all have the ability to do various forms of digital targeting, because they're ultimately digital computers of a specialized kind. Eventually, the same thing will be true of set-top boxes with your television. No one is suggesting we're going to take that old analog 13-channel black and white RCA television that you have in the basement and make that into a vibrant advertising device. But virtually everybody here in the room has some form of set-top box that's connected to your cable or your satellite television in your home or apartment here in the city. It's easy enough to know whose family, what street address, what neighborhood, the demographics of you, and so forth and so on. Those ads will convert an awful lot better than traditional broad advertising. And that's what we're doing. And those businesses are billion-dollar businesses.
And I've heard that you only like businesses that are billion-dollar businesses. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting that businesses start small, but in the internet, things grow very quickly. Another sort of thing you learn in the internet business is that the numbers are always in the hundreds of millions. So at Google, somebody will come in and say, well, we have 2 million users. And we'll go, oh, that's nothing. I go, do you have any idea how many 2 million is? But because there's so many people on the internet is now this very, very large collection of somewhat unmanaged activities. And in that sense, it's this tremendous new platform, right, for services, for businesses, and it will probably over time create a number of other businesses that are even larger than what Google represents as we build more and more infrastructure and more activities.
And most of the businesses you're talking about are advertising based, as would be this.
Well, today they're advertising because it looks like advertising is the best way to reach the average person. The average person is not going to be a subscriber. In most countries, they're not required to pay for pay, in Britain, for example, they have to pay for the BBC. But in general, the advertising models result in a free good for the end user, which they like. Targeted advertising makes sense that it would replace untargeted advertising in some cases. There are people in the room who know these numbers better than I, but the rough numbers are between $500 and $700 billion of worldwide advertising, roughly half in the United States, roughly half elsewhere. Of that, the online advertising, of which we represent, is 20 billion plus sort of industry size. So as more and more of the traditional advertising businesses become targeted, more and more of the advertising industry will be able to use our and our competitors' services. I also want to say I don't believe that the kind of targeted advertising I'm talking about will completely replace all of the other forms of advertising. I think the traditional branded advertising, which we all know and love, will continue. But even with branded advertising, it'll be possible to personalize it. So you can imagine, using the set-top box example that I was using earlier, you can imagine a branded ad, so driving a new car, they can put you in the car, right, and deliver that on your television set. So there's lots and lots of innovation that's now been possible because of the application of digital computing principles and the internet to what were these traditional broadcast and mechanisms. In magazines, you see a similar mechanism. We have been working with advertising partners to actually do targeted ads. Literally, for this block or this zip code or this distribution, we actually show a different set of ads than if you go somewhere else. They perform better than the untargeted ads.
For magazines.
For magazines. And I think that's very hopeful as well. A lot of magazines are having ad revenue problems as the model shifts. This is a potential opportunity for them. Newspapers, we believe, will be the same.
And you'll be involved in that, in the newspaper?
We already have a product that does the magazines, and we're now testing in these other areas. And the other part of our culture that's worth mentioning is we don't know the right answer in almost all of these cases, but we know how to test quickly. And one of the characteristics of these innovative businesses is you just have to keep testing, test, and eventually you find it. The first trials may not work, and so we have to find partners who want to work with us, and they understand we may screw it up.
Now, by your estimation, and I've seen some of the same advertising figures, so we're talking about internet accounting for maybe 3-4% of total advertising. Where will that be 5 years from now?
It'll be much larger. I don't think anybody knows the growth rates. The studies that I've seen indicate that the internet advertising is growing in absolute dollars fastest, and it's also taking share from some of the traditional. However, the definition of internet advertising is beginning to get a little squishy because, of course, many of the advertising that I was describing are really simply the internet is being applied to those advertising businesses. So they're not going away. They're just becoming more targeted.
All of the...
I'm sorry, may I ask?
Yeah.
Everybody here have a cell phone? Right? By the way, when did that happen? What was the year when everyone you knew had a cell phone everywhere all the time? Right? I don't remember, but it wasn't this year, right? So doesn't it make sense that advertising on your mobile phone should be a pretty big business? We just launched a big deal in Japan because who spends more time in the subway per unit of human computing in the world than the Japanese? 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. What do? They look at our ads, right? That's got to be a good business. So there's a lot of reasons to think that these new targeted devices should be very lucrative from an advertising perspective.
Explain a little more about what happens in Japan. You're on your phone, you're going to Google on your telephone, is that?
Actually, more and more people are using the mobile devices, phones and others, to look up information. Mm-hmm. And the new paradigm is looking up information, seeing pictures, and watching short videos. And it's easy enough to marry either short video ads or text ads to that and make some money. And again, it's highly targeted because with the phone, you know the person, you know where the phone is, and in fact, in many cases, you know where they've been, and you can probably predict where they're going to.
And so how does this work in Japan?
Well, in fact, we show those ads. And we target them to where they are, and people see them, and so far they're converting well. So literally an advertiser says, I want to show my ads on somebody's computer as well as on their cell phone.
Mm-hmm. And it's targeted locally?
Targeted to the phone and to the user, and it's search-based in this case.
And how will this translate in the U.S.?
Well, to the degree that we can do these with mobile phone providers, we'll do it here in the U.S. The US, for folks here, I think most people know, is the laggard in the mobile phone world. And the Europeans and the Japanese, and it looks like the Chinese are ahead of the US operators for lots of different reasons. So you're more likely to see this in Europe next.
And how long will it take to get to the US?
It's over the next 12 months. The European trials are this summer. And it looks again like there's such penetration in Europe, and again, so much mobile phone use, and the customers are ready.
So getting back to advertising for just a second,
Sure.
because essentially Google is a very, very, very large advertising company, but it's a cyclical business. I would imagine you're looking at other potential revenue streams. One of the things that we've been reading about is this, the Google payment. Is it G-Buy? Is that what it's called? Right?
Well, that's what the press has nicknamed it.
Oh, it's not
Yeah.
your name. Okay, you could
No.
tell us your
It hasn't
secret
been
name.
It hasn't been announced yet.
And you can announce it
You
here.
you are a world-class reporter, I see. That was very clever. We've not announced a payment system name. What we have, first place, we have not seen the cyclicality in advertising. I know that in the most mature part of advertising there is some cyclical, but I think because it's such a new model, we have not yet seen it. I'm sure we will eventually. We've been focused on advertiser satisfaction, and in studying what advertisers do, the more quickly we can get the advertise to buy cycle to close, the happier our advertisers, who are essentially our customers, our people who pay our bills, be. So we've built and are in the process of testing systems that allow essentially advertisers to purchase, the customer of an advertiser to purchase and fulfill things more quickly than through other mechanisms. And that's what has been rumored as G-Buy.
And so is that something that will be in beta that we're going to?
Very soon in beta, and we'll test it as we go along. But it's targeted, it's very important to know it's targeted at advertisers, not at general consumers. The press has been beside themselves over this versus PayPal, and it's not like PayPal at all.
But that revenue stream would be, that would be like a percentage of sales as
Yeah.
opposed to something that would be purely advertising revenue.
Yes, it would be additional revenue to the company, although it's important to know that the advertising growth rates of this new targeted model are so strong that I think that certainly Google and the people in this business, aside from Google, the vast majority of this revenue is going to be advertising for a very long time, and that's a good thing.
You mentioned earlier that any problem could be solved by launching earlier, essentially. Is that the case? I'm curious about particularly Google Video and Google News, which I think where the expectation level was extremely high for both of those products, and they're both lagging a bit. I think Google Video is the #3 site, and YouTube came in and kind of stole everyone's thunder, and Google News, lags far behind Yahoo, which is the leader there.
I'm not sure I agree with the second point. My data does not agree with that. But in the case of Google Video, we chose a different path than YouTube. We chose to try, and this is an example where we continue to experiment. We chose to build a system where the people who own content, literally CBS, NBA, those sorts of people who have video, could sell them on our site. And that was a deliberate trade-off. And I'm very happy with that decision. YouTube, of course, is targeted at literally putting yourself on the tube. YouTube, by the way, is an advertising partner of Google, so we say nice things about our advertising partners. In the case of Google News, I would disagree with your cast on that. Google News has been enormously successful. This week, 2 days ago, we announced Google Arabic, which is, as far as I know, the only and first pan-Arabic newspaper, and it's online. Now, it's important to know that we don't actually have editors, we don't actually write any of the news. We have algorithms that read all the news and produce essentially the integration or the aggregation of the news. And this is something that the Arab world has never had before. We are also working on translation technology. We have some of the world's best automatic translation technology. So our longer term goal is to be able to do automatic translation from language to language. And we think this is, sort of central to better understanding is, people can see what other people are writing in languages that they don't speak.
Okay. In terms of kind of where you're going in the future, so the One of the things that we've been interested in, that we've heard a lot about, is music. Google did, I believe, some sort of phone deal, right? Was it with Skype? Are these areas that you see as kind of productive for you in the future going ahead?
Yes, those are some of the areas that we're exploring. The easiest way to think about the future is to imagine much larger indices, a lot more information, and a lot more personal, and on every device, in every language, and all of that. So today, does Google have all the world's information? No, we don't. We don't have all the books.